Julie, we are so happy that we've come to know you, and you are an organizer, you write so much, you are a thinker, but then we would like to know well, what shaped your personality, and also how you came to be so committed. So maybe could you tell us some stories about certain moments in your life which you think were very significant? Yes.
Okay. Actually, one thing I think is that I inherited certain characteristics from my father. In particular, my father was quite a free thinker. In fact, he never read books, and he just discovered things through his life and then reflected on them. And one thing I can remember is that my mother told him to go out into the garden and do the weeding, and so he went outside, started doing the weeding, and he came back in and he said, "Oh, I can't do that anymore because I'm disrupting all the ants' nests and all the insects, and it's actually So he was very like that, and he kind of very observant, and I think that I have some of those qualities. So I've always had that concern about. Actually, I've always had a very deep connection with nature. Right from an early age, I remember I had this big thing about the sea and the ocean. I used to have these actually quite bad dreams about almost like tidal waves of going down to the beach and the sea coming out and the big wave coming over my head. And so even as I was a child, I used to go down to the sea at night as a sort of like a sacred relationship. And I didn't learn to swim until I was in my 20s, because I thought we should actually be praying in front of the sea and worshipping it rather than swimming in it. So I always had that kind of connection with nature in particular. Anyway, for one reason or another, I studied economics at university, even though it didn't feel that natural. And when I finished, I thought, well, I'd like to use this for the greater good, and so I got a scholarship to go to work in Africa in the planning division in the government of Botswana, and so it's just that really changed my life completely. Because I saw another way of being, another way of living, and it enabled me to reflect on our own lifestyles in England. And in particular, I felt that my economic tools, if you like, were at best useless, at worst quite dangerous. It was and so I actually learnt a lot from the way of life there, and one thing was I moved out of the town and lived in a village, and really felt a huge sense of community there, and that everyone had a place within the society and also in connection with the land, even the children, and I thought it was very different from the way society was organised in England. And also the great vitality that people had in their lives, even though they might be materially poor and they didn't have much wealth, they had huge wealth in terms of vitality and well-being and sense of place and belonging, and so that really stayed with me. And when I went back to England, I felt there was a huge poverty there of spirit, of meaning, of purpose, that the way we treated sort of unemployed people, old people, are living in very isolated ways and no belonging and really unhappy. And I thought that we needed to re-look at what was well-being and what was poverty. And it wasn't just about material wealth. It was much broader than that. And this community vitality we'd lost in England for the sake of more and more consumer stuff, and that we'd created a very unequal society where a lot of people were redundant. So I I decided to work in environmental issues and environmental economics and international development. I did that for quite a few years at different universities and also applied research. And well, two things happened really. One, I got to the point where I thought, actually, many of the countries that I'm working in, I felt the best thing would be to not disturb their way of thinking and their way of life with international development models. And secondly, that there was work to be done in England in terms of, because that's where the development narrative was coming from, what was desirable, that we should have economic growth, and the most important thing was increased income. And so I thought it's actually better to start looking at what's happening in England and try to change the narrative there, because I don't think it's actually, that narrative is even delivering for the English people, even though they might be materially wealthy. There's a lot of spiritual poverty and poverty of purpose and meaning, and people have lost the meaning of life. So that was happening, and also the other thing was when I was working at the university, I noticed in myself that I was just in my head all the time, and I had no connection to my body or my feelings. In fact, in university or academia, it was very discouraged that you would feel anything. It was all about intellectual analysis. And I felt it was making me very unbalanced, and I also noticed it with my colleagues as well, just in their heads. And I thought, well, we'll have to, we've got to bring our whole being to the table if we want to really address the issues that are facing us as humanity. So I started, to address this imbalance, I started training I started doing yoga, and then I got so fascinated about trying to be more embodied, and then I got very fascinated with it, so I started training in shiatsu, which is a Japanese form of acupressure, and then I got very, very interested in the whole underlying philosophy of shiatsu, and in particular seeing the world through the 5 elements and the dynamic. It's a very dynamic, systemic, holistic way of seeing and being. So I decided that I wanted to train in Chinese medicine, and so I started a training course in acupuncture and in Chinese herbs, and learnt a lot more about that systemic way of life, which pervades the classical thinking in those Asian countries. Although it's I think it's getting lost today. But so I trained in Chinese medicine, and it was the most kind of holistic type of knowledge that I'd ever encountered, but it was a bit problematic because the language of it didn't really, it wasn't well known in the West, or it was regarded as too alternative. But I thought actually maybe we could begin to understand health and dis-ease, not just at levels of individuals, but also in communities and in organisations and societies. Maybe we could apply the same principles. So I started doing this work on healthy and unhealthy organisations using Chinese medicine. I started working with some organisations around this, and I wrote some papers on it as well. But I think it was a bit before its time. It didn't quite work out. So I thought that the main reason was because of the language of it. So I decided to, actually, no, before that, so with this Chinese medicine way of thinking, it's all right, I started applying it to my economics work. So I worked for the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in England, looking at the World Trade Organization and what's wrong with the World Trade Organization. So I decided to use Chinese medicine to try and understand that. I didn't call it that, but I just used that type of thinking. And so in particular, I was looking for reasons why there was so, everybody was very upset with the World Trade Organization. So there was a lot of fire and anger and heatedness around that. And in Chinese medicine, that only occurs wherever there's fire and anger, and you always look for the deficiency somewhere else. So I began to look more systemically about the problem, and I said, actually, there's a big deficiency in the power and the workings of the other bodies of international governance. So UNEP and the WHO and the ILO, all of those institutions need to be strengthened and as strong, if not stronger, than the WTO. So at the moment, because they're not really doing their job, all the issues are. So anyway, I began to look at things in this way. I didn't call it Chinese medicine, but just looking more wherever there's congestion, where's the deficiency, for example. Anyway, I mentioned that that I was looking for another language to describe the same principles as Chinese medicine. So that's why I went to Schumacher College to study the new thinking in science and ecological thinking and complexity thinking, and how that might be able to describe the same type of holistic dynamic as was in Chinese thinking. And so I did that, and I did my thesis there on, it was called Wholeness and Health in the Living Organisation, and it was a comparison of holistic science, new thinking in science, ecological thinking, and classical Chinese thinking, and looking at the parallels, and how you could begin to use that to understand health and well-being in communities and organisations. So after that, when I graduated, this was in 2005, I think, I did various things, but one of them was I worked with the Darlington Hall Trust on their land use management, and I proposed setting up this new incubator on the estate to attract in new land-based sustainable enterprises to create, and it was all using ecological thinking, to create a sort of a circular economy or a synergistic cluster of enterprises. And so rather than having a big top-down land use management strategy, we just created the conditions for people to come in and set up their own enterprises, but not in isolation. They always were connected with other small businesses or activities of the trust. So we have 10 enterprises that came in through that route. Anyway, whilst I was doing that at Schumacher College, they were setting up a new master's program in economics. So they invited me to apply for that role. So I applied for that role, and so headed up the development of the master's program, and we did it in collaboration with two other partners, the New Economics Foundation and the Transition Network, and it was called the MA in Economics for Transition, which was launched 3 years ago and has been very popular, and we've been getting students from all around the world. And more recently, I've also been working on the Schumacher Worldwide program, which is really come over. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just, yeah, and then because it would just be nice for us all to be together.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So the Schumacher Worldwide program is kind of addressing the challenges of how Schumacher College can grow its impact, but not get bigger and bigger, so it loses its small-scale, home-style community education. And so one of the ways that we can be part of that growth is through in a more ecological way of growing, which is really growing in a kind of nested network way. And so the Schumacher Worldwide is kind of so we're beginning to work with other organisations worldwide, and also developing materials to support our alumni. So growing in a more networked, distributed way rather than a great big monolithic Schumacher College.